Hello everybody, this is GM Jesse Kraai, and today I'd like to cover a delightful little game that Nakamura played against Gelfand in the World Team Championship just recently. There he's doing very well with 5.5 out of 6 with a performance rating of over 3,000. And this game is important for a variety of reasons. Obviously a very big game to win against someone who's a World Championship contender now. But also, I think, a very clean demonstration of the power of the King's Indian, even at the very highest level. So let's take a look. Gelfand's playing d4. Let's just play our standard King's Indian moves here. And e5, castles, knight c6. Now, there's a number of different systems that Gelfand has played over the years against the King's Indian, but we're going to see he chooses a slightly offbeat line here, which I have my own suspicions as to why he chose it, which I'll explain later, and that is knight d2. You have the traditional knight e1, and also the very popular b4 as alternatives to knight d2. So knight d2 is a little bit funny because you're blocking the bishop on c1n, but we'll see that white has plans of getting the bishop into the game, and for the moment white's just going to hold down this e4 pawn before he begins expanding on the queen side. Now Nakamura plays a slightly odd looking move in the next move, but to my mind I haven't actually understood why it's any different than the normal move, which is knight d7. Normally one would play knight d7 because you're looking to control the c5 square, as white's really looking to play b4 and c5 in the next couple of moves. But let's just take a look at this. Let's say b4, f5. White really has a nice move here in c5, and black probably shouldn't take that pawn. If he does, there's very nice compensation here for white. And in general, my feeling in this position is that white really is going to be content whenever there's an opening of lines on the queen side. Once we're able to significantly open lines on the queen side, black's counterplay on the king side, as you see here, isn't going to happen. Okay, so in that case, if d takes c isn't that strong, black will have knight f6, which is really just going to transpose back into this game. Okay, so as it was, we have the slightly different move order. Knight e8, b4, f5, c5, knight f6, f3. Okay, now we're going to get very standard King's Indian play with f4. Knight c4, g5, a4, and now some people might play h5 here, but Nakamura is going to play knight g6. Now the knight not only goes a little bit closer to the king side, but black is also intending a very typical King's Indian maneuver with rook f7, followed at some point by bishop f8. Now the bishop on f8 oftentimes will fight for this critical d6 square, and the rook will fight along the 7th rank defensively. But it also has to be seen that there is an offensive idea with this maneuver as well, this regrouping, and that is to eventually put the rook to g7, and from g7 to have exertion upon the g file. And we're going to see those ideas in this game. So, bishop a3. So we see now white's intentions for getting his queen bishop out. Rook f7. And now I think it's a good point to discuss why Gelfand chose this line at all. And that is there's a previous game that Bartholomew played in 2008 against Nakamura, where Bartholomew played a5, which is a little bit funny. In the game we're going to see today, Gelfand prefers the very straightforward b5. But let's take a look at a5. This was a game, a gem of a game that was worthy of a lecture all in itself. That game went like this: h5, b5, d takes c. The problem is that if black plays bishop f8, which is typical in many King's Indian structures, he's going to get ripped apart with b6. That's white's idea. So d takes c, b6, g4, takes, rook takes, knight b5. Now very standard King's Indian play, g3. And there's some very scary things happening for white. The game continues. Knight takes e7, knight takes e4, exclam. Simply trying to open up the queen onto the king's side. Knight e6. I'm just going to play through this game mildly quick, just so you get a sense of the danger that white's faced with here. Bishop takes, pawn takes h2, king takes, queen h4, king g1, knight g3. Now bishop c5 we'll see is forced. The reason is e4 is coming anyway, and black is really threatening bishop d4. And if bishop d4, obviously the queen has to take knight e2. So that's the reason this bishop can never now leave this diagonal, which is important to understand in the following tactic. Rook a4 was played, being tricky in that if ever e3, we can take on e3, and there's a pin along the fourth rank. So rook a4, rook c8, bishop a7, and now a very nice tactic, b5. The point is, if ab, then as I mentioned before, the bishop is not on this diagonal, and simply bishop d4. And notice that it's not just that you lose the queen, it's mate on e2. So after b5, rook b4 was played. Pawn takes, and now I've looked at several lines here for white, and none of them seem to hold. Bishop takes c4 was played. Queen h1, king f2, e3. Bishop takes, pawn takes. Now king takes e3. If king takes g3, queen h4, mate. King takes e3 is simply knight f1, bishop f1, queen g1. And black is completely winning. So it's very reasonable to say that Gelfand had looked at this game and thought to himself, well, look, I have a very pleasant position after the natural move b5 instead of Belyansky's a5. And I'm sure he probably put it into the computer as well. And the problem with the computer is the computer basically thinks that white's always winning in these positions. So b5 was played in the game. And that, I think, is a very beautiful thing about the King's Indian, is that it's an opening which the computer can't understand. In a sense, it can't even play as well as humans. Often, of course, it will find resources, but it doesn't understand the deadly nature of black's attack on the dark squares. And so even at the highest level, we see that players